At 54 years old, I never thought that my life story would end like this. My daughter chose her mother's rich lover, and my mother betrayed me, considering our family unpromising. It all started with a financial crisis. The summer I turned 18 was supposed to be the perfect farewell to my teenage years, a carefree season filled with laughter, late-night talks, and making memories before college. My best friend Sam had invited me to spend a few weeks at his family's cabin, nestled deep in the woods. It was a tradition we'd kept alive for years, boating on the crystal-clear lake, hiking through lush trails, and enjoying the quiet isolation of nature. The Andersons, Sam's family, were like a second family to me. Their cabin felt like home, a place where I could escape the pressures of growing up. Sam's dad, James, was always the life of the party. In his mid-40s, he carried himself with an easygoing charm that made everyone feel welcome. His booming laugh echoed across the cabin during our gatherings, and he treated me as if I were one of his own kids. We joked around together, shared stories by the fire, and bonded over sports games late in the night. To me, James represented everything a father figure should be: kind, supportive, and unwaveringly loyal. Or so I thought. That July began like any other. One afternoon, while sitting by the dock overlooking the serene waters of the lake, Sam received a call from his girlfriend back in town. She needed help moving some furniture, and without hesitation, Sam asked if I minded him leaving for a couple of hours. "Go ahead," I shrugged, trying not to let disappointment creep into my voice. "I'll just hang here, maybe hit the sauna or something." The sauna was a recent addition to their property, tucked away behind the boathouse near the edge of the forest. James had been raving about it ever since they installed it, claiming it was the ultimate way to relax after long days outdoors. I'd used it a few times before, finding comfort in its warmth and solitude. As Sam drove off, I decided this would be the perfect opportunity to unwind alone. Wrapping a towel around my waist, I headed toward the small wooden structure, already anticipating the soothing heat inside. When I stepped inside, the familiar wave of warmth enveloped me instantly. Steam rose gently from the rocks heated beneath the wooden benches, carrying with it the earthy scent of pine and cedar. I tossed my towel onto the bench and sat down, leaning back against the rough-hewn wood. Closing my eyes, I let the stress melt away, feeling the tension leave my muscles bit by bit. For a moment, everything seemed perfect. The world outside faded away, leaving only the rhythmic sound of my breathing and the comforting embrace of the sauna. But then, after about 15 minutes of peaceful silence, the door creaked open. Startled, I opened my eyes to see James stepping inside. He wore nothing but a towel slung loosely around his waist, his skin glistening with sweat for what must have been a run earlier that day. "Mind if I join?" he asked casually, his tone light and friendly, though there was something in his demeanor that caught me off guard. Sure," I stammered, adjusting my position slightly. I hadn't expected him to come in. After all, it wasn't exactly spacious in there. But it was his place, his sanctuary, so I figured I couldn't really object. Still, something about the situation felt strange, not outright wrong, but different somehow. Maybe it was the way he moved, or how his gaze lingered just a fraction too long when our eyes met. James settled onto the bench beside me, closer than necessary given the size of the room. For a while, neither of us spoke. The air grew heavier, charged with an energy I couldn't quite define. I tried to focus on the heat, letting it work its magic like always, but now every movement, every sound seemed amplified. When James finally broke the silence, his words sent a shiver down my spine. "You look tense," he said, his voice low and calm, yet tinged with an undertone I couldn't ignore. "You gotta let the heat work its magic. Loosen up a bit." "I'm fine," I replied quickly, forcing a smile despite the sudden pounding of my heart. Why did his comment make me so uneasy? Was it paranoia, or was there something else lurking beneath the surface? James chuckled softly, shifting slightly closer. His elbow brushed against mine, and though it might have seemed accidental, the contact sent a jolt through me. Every nerve ending screamed at me to move away, but I froze, unsure whether my reaction would seem overly dramatic. Instead, I wiped the sweat from my brow and forced myself to appear relaxed, even as unease bubbled beneath the surface. He glanced at me sideways, his expression unreadable. There was something in his eyes, an intensity one hadn't noticed before, that made my stomach twist uncomfortably. "You've used a sauna before, right?" he asked, almost teasingly. "A couple of times," I muttered, avoiding direct eye contact. Each word felt heavier than the last, like walking through quicksand. What was happening here? This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. James nodded slowly, still watching me intently. "Good, because I think you'll find this one helps more than just your muscles." His voice dropped slightly, taking on a softer, more intimate quality. "It clears your mind, helps you relax completely." Relax? That was the last thing I wanted to do. My mind raced, searching for ways to change the subject, to create distance between us. But no matter how hard I tried, the conversation kept circling back to topics that left me feeling increasingly exposed. And then, without warning, James reached out, placing a hand lightly on my shoulder. "You sure you're okay?" he murmured, his touch lingering far longer than appropriate. My breath hitched, panic rising like bile in my throat. This couldn't be real. Not James, not Sam's dad. He was family, or at least he had been. Before I could respond, his fingers slid down my arm, tracing invisible patterns along my skin. A cold dread settled in my chest, freezing me in place. How'd I get here? Just moments ago, I'd been lost in thought, basking in the simple joy of solitude. Now, trapped in this tiny space, I realized I didn't know how to escape without causing a scene. "You seem a little tense," James continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's okay to let go sometimes. You're safe here." Safe? Safe. My mind screamed at me to stand up, to push past him and flee into the cool evening air. Yet my body betrayed me, rooted to the spot as if glued to the bench. All I could do was nod mutely, praying silently for the ground to swallow me whole. As the seconds stretched into eternity, the atmosphere inside the sauna became suffocating. The once comforting warmth now pressed against my skin like a heavy blanket, trapping me under its weight. James leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his presence looming larger than ever. When he spoke again, his words hung in the air like smoke, thick and unyielding. "You've grown up so much these past few years," he said, his tone thoughtful, becoming quite the young man. My cheeks flushed hot, embarrassment mingling with confusion. Where was this coming from? Before I could process his statement fully, he added, "Sam's lucky to have someone like you as his best friend." For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe he meant well, that perhaps I was reading too much into his actions. After all, people said strange things when cooped up in close quarters. But then his hand returned, settling warmly on my thigh this time. Any lingering doubts vanished in an instant. This wasn't innocent. This wasn't platonic. Adrenaline surged through my veins, sharpening my senses. Every muscle tensed, ready to spring into action if need be. Yet fear paralyzed me, locking my limbs in place. How could I confront someone who held such authority in my life? Someone whose approval mattered deeply to both Sam and me? And yet, despite the fear gnawing at my insides, another part of me, the rational, logical part, knew I had to act fast. If I stayed silent, things could escalate further. If I stayed silent, I risked losing not just myself, but also the bond one shared with Sam. Summoning every ounce of courage I possessed, I cleared my throat and managed to croak out, "James, I think I've been in here long enough." My voice shook slightly, betraying my inner turmoil. Thankfully, he seemed taken aback by my abruptness, pulling his hand away as though burned. "Right?" he mumbled, breaking eye contact for the first time since entering. "Guess you're right. Don't want to overdo it." Relief washed over me as he stood, stretching dramatically before heading toward the door. As the heavy wooden panel swung shut behind him, I exhaled sharply, collapsing onto the bench in relief. My hands trembled uncontrollably, and beads of sweat trickled down my temples, mixing with the condensation dripping from the walls. What had just happened? Had I imagined it? Was I overreacting? Questions swirled chaotically in my mind, each one more terrifying than the last. One thing was certain, though, nothing about that interaction felt right. And deep down, I knew I couldn't stay silent forever. Not if I wanted to protect the people and relationships I cared about most. The days following that first encounter in the sauna were a haze of confusion and unease. Every time I saw James, my heart raced, not with excitement, but with dread. I tried to avoid him as much as possible, finding excuses to stay away from the cabin when Sam wasn't around. But it was impossible to escape entirely. The Andersons' home felt smaller somehow, every corner charged with an uncomfortable tension that hadn't been there before. Sam noticed nothing. He continued his carefree routine, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. We spent our afternoons boating on the lake, hiking through the forest trails, and laughing by the fire at night. To anyone looking in, everything seemed perfect. Yet inside, I was unraveling. Each glance James sent my way made me flinch. Each casual comment he threw in a conversation left me questioning whether it carried hidden meaning. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was living in two separate worlds, one where life was still normal, and another where danger lurked just out of sight. One evening, while preparing dinner with Gloria, James's wife, I found myself opening up more than I intended. She had always been kind, warm, and welcoming, the type of person who made you feel instantly comfortable. As we chopped vegetables together, she asked how things were going back home, if college preparations were stressful. Her genuine concern softened something within me, and for a moment, I almost told her everything. But then I remembered, this was James's family, too. Telling Gloria would mean destroying not only their marriage, but also the fragile bond one shared with Sam. So instead, I smiled weakly and mumbled something about being excited for school. That night, lying awake in my bed, I replayed the events of the day over and over again. Why had James acted the way he did? Was it all in my head, or had I truly misread the situation? Part of me wanted to believe it was some sort of misunderstanding, a fleeting lapse in judgment that wouldn't happen again. But deep down, I knew better. There was something deliberate in his actions, a calculated move meant to test boundaries. And now, those boundaries felt dangerously close to breaking. The next morning, Sam suggested we take the boat out onto the lake early, before the heat of the day set in. It sounded like the perfect opportunity to clear my mind, so I agreed without hesitation. The water was calm, reflecting the pale blue sky above us. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to forget about the turmoil back at the cabin. We fished lazily, talked about old memories, and laughed until tears streamed down our faces. It felt good to be reminded of the friendship Sam and I once shared, a friendship untainted by doubt or fear. But reality came crashing back later that afternoon. When we returned to the cabin, James was waiting for us on the porch, leaning casually against one of the wooden pillars. His presence alone was enough to make my stomach churn. "Where have you two been?" he called out, his tone light and teasing. Sam grinned and replied, "Just fishing. Didn't catch anything big, though." James chuckled and clapped Sam on the shoulder. "Well, maybe next time. How about we grill tonight? I picked up some steaks earlier." Before either of us could respond, he turned his attention to me. "Christian, right? You haven't been spending much time here lately. Are you avoiding us?" His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Avoiding? If only it were that simple. I forced a laugh, hoping it sounded natural. "No, just busy catching up on reading." I lied, avoiding eye contact. Last-minute summer assignments." "Ah, responsible kid," James said, nodding approvingly. But there was a gleam in his eyes that sent shivers down my spine. He didn't press further, which only added to my unease. What game was he playing? Dinner that night was tense. Sam chattered endlessly about plans for the weekend, perhaps a trip into town for ice cream, or another hike along the mountain trail, but I barely heard him. My focus remained fixed on James, who sat across the table, occasionally glancing in my direction. Each time our gazes met, I quickly looked away, pretending to examine the food on my plate. By the end of the meal, I excused myself under the pretense of needing fresh air. Outside, the evening breeze offered little relief. Leaning against the railing of the deck, I stared out at the darkening horizon, trying desperately to organize my thoughts. This couldn't keep happening. Whatever this thing was between James and me, it needed to stop. But how? Confronting him directly seemed reckless, especially given the potential consequences. Reporting him felt equally fraught. Doing so would tear apart not only Sam's family, but also our lifelong friendship. As I stood there wrestling with these questions, I heard footsteps behind me. Turning slowly, I saw James approaching, hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans. "Beautiful night, isn't it?" he remarked, stopping a few feet away. His voice was smooth, almost conversational, but I recognized the undertone immediately. "It is," I replied stiffly, keeping my distance. He tilted his head slightly, studying me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "You've been distant lately," he observed. "Is everything okay?" "I'm fine," I said quickly, perhaps too quickly. "Just tired." James smirked faintly, taking another step closer. "Tired, huh? Or maybe you're avoiding me." My pulse quickened. "Why would I do that?" "Oh, come on, Christian," he said, using my name in a way that felt deliberately provocative. "We both know what happened in the sauna wasn't exactly innocent." I froze, unsure how to respond. Denial seemed futile, yet admitting anything felt equally dangerous. "It was a mistake," I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. "It shouldn't have happened." "A mistake," James echoed, raising an eyebrow. Or maybe it was something more, something neither of us expected. "No," I insisted, shaking my head. "It doesn't matter what it was. It can't happen again." For a moment, James regarded me silently, his expression unreadable. Then, unexpectedly, he sighed and stepped back. "All right," he said eventually, though his tone lacked conviction. "If that's what you want." Relief washed over me, though it was short-lived. Despite his apparent acquiescence, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not really. James had shown me a side of himself I never imagined existed, and now I wondered how long it would be before he revealed it again. Over the following days, I doubled down on my efforts to steer clear of him. Whenever Sam invited me to join him and James for activities around the cabin, I politely declined, citing fatigue or other obligations. At first, James seemed content to let me go, maintaining a respectful distance during group gatherings. However, small moments kept creeping up, his hand brushing against mine accidentally, prolonged looks whenever he thought no one else was watching. These subtle gestures gnawed at me, reminding me that the line between professionalism and impropriety was thinner than ever. By the end of the week, the pressure became almost unbearable. I knew I couldn't remain silent forever, but confessing felt equally daunting. One particularly stifling afternoon, Sam announced he'd be heading into town to meet friends, leaving me alone with James once more. Panic surged through me, but I couldn't think of a valid reason to tag along. Besides, avoiding him indefinitely wasn't a solution. It was merely delaying the inevitable. When Sam drove off, I retreated to the dock, seeking solace in the cool lake breeze. For a while, I let myself drift into thought, imagining scenarios where none of this had happened, where James was simply the friendly father figure I'd always known, and I could return home without guilt weighing heavily on my shoulders. But as soon as the fantasy began, it dissolved, replaced by the harsh truth. Things would never go back to the way they were. And then, predictably, James appeared. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, already lowering himself onto the bench beside me. "No, go ahead," I muttered, bracing myself for whatever came next. We sat in silence for several minutes, the only sounds coming from the gentle lapping of water against the wood. Finally, James broke the quiet. "You know, Christian, people often say life has a way of testing your limits, pushing you past comfort zones you didn't even realize existed." "What does that mean?" I asked cautiously, though I feared I already knew. "It means," he continued, turning to face me, "that sometimes we find ourselves drawn to things or people we never anticipated. And that's okay. In fact, it's human nature." "Stop," I interrupted sharply, standing abruptly. "Don't try to justify this. What happened in the sauna, it was wrong. End of story." James rose slowly, his movements deliberate. "Wrong according to whose rules? Yours? Mine? Or society's?" "This isn't about rules," I shot back, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to remain calm. "It's about respect, about knowing where the lines are, and staying on the right side of them." He studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to my surprise, he nodded. "Fair enough," he conceded, stepping back slightly. "But don't pretend this is easy for me either. Don't act like I'm the only one caught in this mess." Before I could respond, he walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts. Though his words lingered, I clung to the hope that this might mark the beginning of the end, that James would finally leave me alone. But deep down, I understood the truth. This was far from resolved. The question wasn't whether it would happen again, it was when. and how far I'd let it go before drawing the line myself. The days that followed the incident in the sauna were filled with a tension so thick it felt like an invisible storm cloud hovering over me. Every glance James sent my way, every casual brush of his hand against mine during group activities, left me on edge. I tried to convince myself that what had happened was just a fleeting moment, a lapse in judgment that wouldn't be repeated. But deep down, I knew better. The way he looked at me now carried a weight I couldn't ignore, as if he were waiting for the right moment to make another move. Sam remained blissfully unaware of the turmoil brewing beneath the surface. He spent his days fishing, hiking, and laughing by the lake, completely absorbed in the carefree summer vibe we'd always shared. Whenever Sam wasn't around, though, James seemed to find excuses to linger near me. At first, it was small things, asking for my opinion on which tools to use for boat maintenance, or complimenting my choice of books from the cabin's modest library. Each interaction left me feeling more uneasy, each smile masking something darker beneath. One afternoon, while Sam was out helping his girlfriend Claire move furniture into her new apartment, James cornered me again. This time, it was in the kitchen, where I had retreated to grab a glass of water after hours spent under the scorching sun. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of birds chirping outside. Without warning, James leaned casually against the counter, blocking my path to the door. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his tone light, but laced with something else, something predatory. His eyes locked onto mine, searching for a reaction. "I haven't been avoiding you," I stammered, clutching the countertop behind me for support. My heart raced, pounding so loudly I feared he could hear it too. "I've just been busy." James chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Don't play games with me, kid. You're good at hiding your feelings, but not that good." He took a step closer, closing the already narrow gap between us. "There's no need to pretend anymore. We both know what happened in the sauna." My breath hitched, panic rising like a tidal wave inside me. How could he talk about it so casually, like it was nothing, like it hadn't shattered the fragile trust one once had in him? "It shouldn't have happened," I whispered, forcing myself to meet his gaze despite the fear coursing through me. "You're Sam's dad. That changes everything, does it?" James tilted his head slightly, studying me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "What does it make it even more exciting? Think about it. You're part of our family. There's this unspoken bond between us, something deeper than most people understand. Why fight it?" His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Was he serious? Could he really believe any of this? Yet, buried beneath the outrage and fear, there was a flicker of confusion, a tiny voice whispering doubts about whether I should resist or give in. I pushed those thoughts away immediately, reminding myself of who James truly was, my best friend's father, someone who should never have crossed such a boundary. "I can't do this," I managed to say, my voice trembling. "Not with Sam. Not with his mom. It's wrong." James didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached out slowly, his fingers brushing against my arm in what might have passed for a comforting gesture, if I hadn't known better. "You don't have to tell anyone," he murmured, his voice dropping lower. "This can stay between us. No one has to know." "No," I exclaimed, louder than intended. My voice echoed through the empty kitchen, startling even myself. "That's exactly why this needs to stop. Secrets like these destroy people. They ruin lives." For a moment, James froze, his confident demeanor faltering ever so slightly. Then, without saying anything further, he stepped back, giving me some much-needed space. But the damage was done. The air between us remained charged, heavy with unspoken tension. As soon as he left the kitchen, I bolted toward the door, needing fresh air to clear my mind. Outside, the world seemed unchanged, the same blue sky, the same gentle breeze rustling through the trees, but everything inside me felt different. What had started as a simple betrayal of trust was quickly spiraling into something far more complicated. And worst of all, I realized that James wasn't going to let this go easily. If anything, his persistence only grew stronger with each passing day. Later that evening, during dinner, I found myself hyper-aware of James's presence across the table. He joked and laughed alongside Sam and Gloria, acting as though nothing unusual had occurred. Meanwhile, I struggled to keep up appearances, nodding along to their conversation while trying desperately to focus on anything but the memories haunting me. When Sam suggested we spend the next morning boating on the lake, I hesitated before agreeing, knowing full well that being alone with James on the water would likely lead to trouble. But refusing outright felt impossible. Saying no would raise questions, and I wasn't ready to face them. Not yet. So, I forced a smile and nodded, hoping against hope that James would respect whatever boundaries I tried to set. Unfortunately, my optimism proved misplaced. The following morning, as we pushed off from the dock, the calm waters reflected the golden hues of sunrise, creating a picturesque scene that did little to ease my anxiety. Sam chattered excitedly about catching fish for breakfast, oblivious to the growing unease beside him. Once we were far enough from shore, James turned to me, his expression unreadable. "You okay, Christian?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of concern, or maybe it was calculation. It was hard to tell anymore. "Yeah, I'm fine," I replied quickly, avoiding eye contact. My hands gripped the edges of the boat tightly, knuckles turning white. James smirked faintly, leaning back against the seat. "Good, because I thought maybe, well, you seemed distant lately. Distracted. I've just got a lot on my mind," I muttered, wishing the ground, or rather, the water, would swallow me whole. Why couldn't he leave me alone? He didn't push the issue further, at least not verbally. However, throughout the morning, subtle touches became harder to ignore, his hand brushing against mine when reaching for bait, his shoulder pressing lightly against mine as we adjusted the oars. Each contact sent shivers down my spine, leaving me paralyzed with uncertainty. How long could I keep pretending this was normal? By midday, I reached my breaking point. As Sam dove into the lake to cool off, I seized the opportunity to confront James directly. "We need to talk," I blurted out, surprising even myself with the suddenness of my words. James raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "About this," I said, gesturing vaguely between us. "Whatever this is, it needs to end. Now." He studied me silently for several moments, his earlier charm replaced by a calculating seriousness. "You sure about that?" he finally asked, his tone low and deliberate. "Because I think you enjoyed it more than you're letting on." Anger surged through me, replacing the fear that had dominated my thoughts until now. "That's not true," I shot back, my voice rising despite my best efforts to remain calm. "What happened was wrong. End of story." James sighed, running a hand through his hair. For a brief moment, I thought I saw regret flash across his face. But then it vanished, replaced by determination. "Fine," he conceded, though his words lacked conviction. "If that's what you want." Relief washed over me, though it was short-lived. Despite his apparent acquiescence, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not really. James had shown me a side of himself I never imagined existed, and now I wondered how long it would take for him to reveal it again. As we returned to the cabin later that afternoon, I resolved to distance myself as much as possible. If staying meant risking another confrontation, then perhaps it was time to reconsider my plans altogether. Maybe returning home early wasn't such a bad idea after all. But telling Sam the truth? That was a bridge I wasn't prepared to cross. Not yet. The thought of destroying everything we'd built together, of losing the friendship I cherished most in the world, left me frozen with indecision. Still, one thing was certain. This situation couldn't continue. Something had to change, and soon. That night, lying awake in bed, I replayed the events of the day over and over again. James's words echoed in my mind, twisting and turning until they morphed into something sinister. What if he didn't stop? What if he kept pushing until I cracked? And worse still, what if I let him win? Exhaustion eventually claimed me, but even sleep offered no reprieve. Dreams haunted me, replaying scenes from the sauna and the boat ride, mixing reality with nightmare until I couldn't tell them apart. When dawn broke, I knew one thing for sure. Surviving the rest of the summer would require every ounce of strength I possessed. And if James refused to back down, I'd have to decide whether protecting myself meant betraying Sam, or losing everything I held dear. The days following that fateful afternoon in Pablo's home were a haze of confusion and turmoil. Every glance from him, every casual touch, felt like a silent reminder of what had happened, and what could happen again. I tried to maintain my composure around Gloria, forcing smiles and laughing at her jokes as if nothing was wrong. But inside, my mind raced with questions that refused to be answered. How could this have happened? Why'd I let it go so far? And most importantly, how could I protect my family without destroying everything we'd built? One evening, while helping Gloria choose paint samples for the living room, I noticed Pablo lingering in the doorway, watching me intently. His presence alone sent shivers down my spine, but I forced myself to focus on the task at hand. What do you think about this one? Gloria asked, holding up a swatch of soft gray. It's perfect, I replied quickly, avoiding eye contact with Pablo. He didn't say anything, but his gaze lingered just a moment too long before he finally retreated to another part of the house. That night, lying awake in bed beside Miguel, I replayed the events over and over in my mind. The tension between Pablo and me was becoming unbearable, and I knew I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. Yet, the thought of confessing everything to Miguel, or even Gloria, felt like an impossible burden. What would they think of me? Could I ever explain how I ended up in such a compromising position? My heart ached with guilt, knowing I had betrayed their trust, even if only through my own inaction. Determined to put some distance between us, I began finding excuses to avoid spending time alone with Pablo. If Gloria wasn't around, I claimed to have errands or appointments elsewhere. At first, I thought he might respect my boundaries, but soon it became clear that wasn't the case. During one particularly tense encounter, when Gloria had stepped out briefly to answer a phone call, Pablo cornered me in the kitchen. "Christina," he began, his voice low and deliberate, "you've been avoiding me." "I haven't been avoiding anyone," I stammered, clutching the edge of the counter for support. My heart pounded in my chest, betraying the calm exterior I was trying so hard to maintain. "Oh, come now," he said, taking a step closer. "We both know what happened. There's no need to pretend anymore." My breath hitched as panic surged through me. "What happened doesn't change anything," I whispered, shaking my head. "You're married to my daughter. That changes everything." For a moment, Pablo froze, his confident demeanor faltering ever so slightly. Then, with a sly smile, he leaned against the counter, narrowing the gap between us. "Marriage isn't always what it seems," he murmured, his tone almost teasing. "Sometimes people grow apart. Sometimes they find connections where they least expect them." Anger flared within me, hot and fierce. How dare he make light of our situation, of the lives he was threatening to destroy? "Don't twist this into something it's not," I snapped, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to remain composed. "This isn't about connection, it's about betrayal, about crossing lines that should never have been crossed." Pablo raised an eyebrow, clearly unfazed by my outburst. "Is it really?" he countered, stepping even closer. "Or are you scared of what you feel?" I recoiled, horrified by the implication. "Feelings don't justify ruining lives," I shot back, my voice rising. "If you care about Gloria at all, you'll stop this right now." To my relief, Gloria chose that moment to return, interrupting whatever response Pablo might have given. He straightened immediately, adopting the same charming facade he always wore in front of others. "Just discussing color schemes," he explained smoothly, flashing a grin that failed to reach his eyes. Gloria smiled back, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. Over the next few days, I doubled down on my efforts to distance myself from Pablo. Whenever possible, I steered conversations toward practical matters, focusing solely on the renovation project. But no matter how hard I tried, his presence continued to loom large in my thoughts. Each time I saw him, whether during family dinners or casual run-ins around the house, I felt the familiar pull, the same uneasy mix of fear and attraction that had led me astray in the first place. Then came the day when Gloria announced she needed help moving furniture into the new house. "Can you two handle it together?" she asked brightly, turning to both of us. "I've got a meeting with my boss later today." A knot formed in my stomach as I exchanged a wary glance with Pablo. "Of course," he said smoothly, his expression unreadable. Reluctantly, I agreed, knowing there was no way to refuse without raising suspicion. When we arrived at the house, the atmosphere was heavy with unspoken tension. We worked in silence, each movement feeling more awkward than the last. As we lifted a heavy dresser onto its new spot, Pablo brushed against me accidentally, or so it seemed. For a split second, his hand lingered on mine, sending a jolt through my body. I pulled away quickly, pretending to adjust my grip. You can't keep running forever, he whispered suddenly, catching me off guard. His words hung in the air like a challenge, daring me to respond. I'm not running, I retorted sharply, though my voice betrayed the tremor in my resolve. I'm doing what's right. Pablo chuckled softly, shaking his head. Right for who? Yourself? Your family? Or just your conscience? His question struck a nerve, forcing me to confront truths I'd been desperately trying to ignore. Was I truly acting out of principle, or was I simply afraid of facing my own desires? The uncertainty gnawed at me, making it harder to focus on anything else. As the afternoon wore on, the heat of the sun pressing down on us, Pablo grew increasingly bold. Small touches turned into lingering glances, subtle comments carried deeper meanings, and the air between us crackled with tension. By the time we finished moving the last piece of furniture, I was practically vibrating with anxiety. Thanks for your help, Pablo said casually, leaning against the wall as I wiped sweat from my brow. His casual stance belied the intensity in his eyes. Gloria's lucky to have someone like you looking out for her. Gloria deserves better than this, I replied stiffly, refusing to meet his gaze. She deserves honesty. And what about you? He pressed, closing the distance between us. What do you deserve? Before I could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway. Gloria was back earlier than expected. Panic surged through me as I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a pile of boxes. Pablo smirked faintly, his expression triumphant yet calculating. He knew he had pushed me to my limits, and he wasn't done yet. That evening, as I drove home, my mind raced with conflicting emotions. On one hand, I told myself repeatedly that none of this was real, that Pablo's advances were nothing more than misplaced affection born of loneliness. On the other hand, I couldn't deny the spark of something deeper buried beneath the guilt and shame. It terrified me, this realization that my feelings weren't entirely one-sided. By the time I reached our quiet suburban street, exhaustion weighed heavily on my shoulders. Miguel greeted me warmly at the door, handing me a glass of wine as we settled into the familiar rhythm of dinner conversation. Yet for once, his stories about work and plans for the future fell flat. All I could think about was Pablo's final words. What do you deserve? Later that night, as Miguel slept peacefully beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The weight of my secret threatened to crush me, but I knew I couldn't share it. Not yet. Instead, I resolved to take control of the situation. If Pablo wouldn't back down, then I would. Starting tomorrow, I vowed I would cut ties completely. No more visits to their house. No more involvement in a renovation project. Whatever it took to protect my family, I would do it. But deep down, I feared it wouldn't be enough. Pablo had already shown he wasn't willing to let go easily. And if history taught me anything, it was that persistence often won out in the end. The following week passed in a blur of carefully choreographed avoidance. I made excuses whenever Gloria suggested another meeting, citing prior commitments or health issues that weren't entirely true. To my relief, she didn't push the matter, too preoccupied with wedding preparations to notice my growing distance. But Pablo was another story altogether. One afternoon, while shopping for groceries, I spotted him across the aisle. Dressed casually in jeans and a polo shirt, he looked every bit the successful husband and father, but the look in his eyes told a different story. Before I could turn away, he called out my name, forcing me to face him. "Christina," he said, approaching with that easygoing charm that had once seemed so harmless. "Fancy seeing you here." "Hello, Pablo," I replied coolly, keeping my distance. "How's everything going with the house?" "Great," he answered, his smile widening. "Though I must admit, it hasn't been the same without your input. Maybe we could catch up sometime." "I'm afraid I'm quite busy these days," I said firmly, turning to walk away. But his next words stopped me in my tracks. "Even busier than you were before?" he asked softly, his tone dripping with innuendo. "Because I remember how much time you used to have for certain discussions." Heat flooded my cheeks as I spun back to face him. "Don't test me, Pablo," I warned, my voice barely above a whisper. "This ends now." He tilted his head slightly, studying me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "Does it?" he murmured, his smile fading into something darker. "Or are you just scared of what comes next?" Before I could respond, a group of shoppers passed between us, breaking the spell. Seizing the opportunity, I hurried down the aisle, vowing never to let him corner me again. Yet, as I loaded my groceries into the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that Pablo was right. Somewhere deep inside, I was afraid, not just of him, but of myself. Back home, I threw myself into household chores, hoping to distract my mind from spiraling further into chaos. Cooking dinner, folding laundry, organizing closets, anything to keep my hands busy and my thoughts at bay. But no matter how many tasks I completed, the questions remained. Could I truly walk away from this mess unscathed? Or had I already crossed a point of no return? Miguel noticed my restlessness eventually, pulling me aside one evening after dinner. "Are you okay?" he asked gently, concern etched into his features. "You've seemed distant lately." "I'm fine," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just stressed about work." He nodded, accepting my explanation without hesitation. "Well, don't forget, you can talk to me anytime. You know that, right?" Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes as I hugged him tightly. How could I hurt someone so kind, so loving? Someone who had stood by me through thick and thin? And yet, despite my determination to protect him, the memory of Pablo's touch lingered in the back of my mind, refusing to fade. By the weekend, I realized I couldn't keep avoiding the issue indefinitely. Gloria invited me to join her and Pablo for lunch at a nearby cafe, a gesture meant to bridge the growing gap between us. Reluctantly, I accepted, telling myself it would be my final attempt to salvage the relationship without revealing the truth. The meal started innocently enough, filled with light-hearted chatter about upcoming family gatherings and holiday plans. But halfway through dessert, Pablo leaned forward, fixing me with a piercing stare. "Christina," he began, his tone deceptively casual, "I've been meaning to ask. You've seemed distracted lately. Is everything all right?" Gloria glanced between us, clearly sensing the tension but unable to define it. "Mom's just been busy," she interjected quickly. "Right, Mom?" "Yes," I echoed, forcing a laugh. "Just busy." But Pablo wasn't satisfied. Later, as Gloria excused herself to use the restroom, he seized the opportunity to lean closer. "You can't keep hiding forever," he whispered, his breath warm against my ear. "Sooner or later, you'll have to face the truth." My blood ran cold as he walked away, leaving me trembling with a mix of anger and fear. Truth. That single word echoed in my mind long after we parted ways, haunting me with possibilities I dared not explore. As I drove home that afternoon, I knew one thing for certain. This game of cat and mouse couldn't continue. Something had to change, and fast. But the harder question remained. What exactly was I willing to sacrifice to make it stop? The days that followed were a blur of confusion and turmoil. Each morning, I woke up to the same question echoing in my mind. How could I let this happen? The weight of reality pressed down on me as I tried to navigate the new world where everything felt different, where every glance, every word carried hidden meanings. My guilt was suffocating, but so was the fear of losing everything I held dear. One evening, after another grueling day of dodging Pablo's increasingly bold advances, I returned home exhausted. Miguel greeted me with warmth, his presence grounding me in ways I hadn't fully appreciated until now. As we sat together for dinner, he shared stories from work, laughing about office drama and small victories. His voice brought comfort, yet it also reminded me how much I stood to lose if the truth ever came out. I forced myself to smile, nodding at all the right moments, but inside, I was unraveling. That night, as Miguel slept peacefully beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The quiet hum of the house amplified my racing thoughts. What had started as fleeting discomfort had escalated into something far more dangerous, a secret threatening to destroy not only my marriage, but also my relationship with Gloria. Yet despite the overwhelming guilt, there was another emotion lurking beneath the surface. Shame. Shame for feeling drawn to someone who wasn't mine to desire. Shame for doubting whether I truly deserved the life I had built. By the weekend, I knew I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. If Pablo didn't back off soon, I would have no choice but to distance myself completely, even if it meant withdrawing from the renovation project altogether. On Sunday afternoon, while helping Gloria arrange furniture in her living room, I made my decision clear. "I think I need to step back," I said firmly, though my voice trembled slightly. Work has been demanding lately, and I don't want to neglect other responsibilities. Gloria looked surprised, but understanding. Are you sure, Mom? You've been such a huge help. Her words stung. Not because they weren't true, but because I feared she'd never forgive me if she knew the real reason behind my withdrawal. I'm sure, I replied softly, forcing a smile. But I'll always be here if you need advice. Pablo watched our exchange silently, his expression unreadable. When Gloria left the room briefly, he leaned closer, his tone low and deliberate. You can't run forever, Christina. I'm not running. I snapped, keeping my voice steady despite the panic rising within me. I'm doing what's right, for your family, for mine. For a moment, his confident demeanor faltered. Then, with a sly smile, he whispered, maybe you're just scared of what comes next. His parting shot lingered in the air long after he walked away. That night, I resolved to take control of the situation once and for all. If Pablo wouldn't respect boundaries, then I would make sure there were none left for him to cross. Over the following weeks, I threw myself into work, using the long hours as both an escape and a shield against further encounters with Pablo. Whenever possible, I avoided family gatherings or any situation where I might find myself alone with him. At first, Gloria seemed hurt by my absence, but she eventually accepted my excuses without pressing further. Meanwhile, Miguel noticed nothing unusual, too absorbed in his own routines to question my sudden busyness. But even as I distanced myself physically, the emotional scars remained. Every time I saw Pablo, at a grocery store, during a casual family dinner, I felt the familiar pull of tension and unease. He didn't stop trying to corner me, his subtle touches and lingering glances like needles pricking at my resolve. Yet deep down, I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't allow this toxic dynamic to continue. It wasn't until months later, when Gloria announced she and Pablo were expecting their first child, that I finally found closure. Watching them together, their joy radiating through every word and gesture, I realized how foolish I'd been to entertain such dangerous feelings. This was their future, their happiness. It wasn't mine to disrupt. Still, the experience left lasting marks. While I managed to rebuild some semblance of normalcy with Miguel, I couldn't shake the nagging doubt that crept into my heart whenever I thought about trust and loyalty. Life moved forward, but part of me stayed frozen in those stifling moments in the sauna, replaying choices I wished I could undo. And so, I learned a painful lesson. Sometimes, love isn't enough to protect us from ourselves, but courage and honesty are the keys to reclaiming peace.